Callisto Protocol will, in fact, scare the pants off of all of us. There will be no more pants.
The Callisto Protocol, the game that promised to resurrect survival horror and instead left me praying for a resurrection of my free time. Hyped as the spiritual successor to Dead Space, this was supposed to be the triumphant return of atmospheric dread, suffocating tension, and nerve-shattering terror. Instead, what we got was 8 hours of vent crawling, floaty controls, and a plot so stupid it makes Resident Evil 6 look like Shakespeare. So, was the Callisto Protocol really that bad? Oh, you bet your ass it was. Let's get into it. Released in December 2022, the Callisto Protocol strutted onto the stage with all the confidence of a prom king, and about the same amount of substance. Glenn Schofield, the co-creator of Dead Space, was at the helm. The hype machine was in overdrive, complete with a glossy 3-part docuseries about the game's development. This was meant to be the return of sci-fi horror. Unfortunately, it walked straight into one of the most stacked years in gaming. Elden Ring, God of War Ragnarok, Modern Warfare 2, Pokemon Arceus, A Plague Tale Requiem, LEGO Star Wars The Skywalker Saga. Callisto Protocol wasn't competing against shovelware, it was trying to survive against titans. Even if it had been brilliant, it would have struggled. But when you're average at best, you're roadkill. And just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, the very next month delivered the coup de grace. But we'll come back to that. Now, before we get into the criticism, let's take a moment to outline the narrative. For the sake of context, I'm going to walk you through the basic story beats as they happen. There are some major problems with the writing, but we'll save those for after the groundwork is set. The Callisto Protocol is set in the year 2320. You play as Jacob Lee, a cargo pilot contracted to transport crates from Black Iron Prison on Callisto to Europa. It's a routine job until his ship is attacked by the Outer Way, a resistance group fighting against the ruling United Jupiter Company. Among them is Danny Nakamura, a figure already known to the public as a leader of this movement. The skirmish sends the ship crashing onto Callisto's surface, killing Jacob's co-pilot Max and leaving both Jacob and Danny in custody of Black Iron's head of security, Captain Ferris. Without trial or explanation, Jacob is thrown into a cell and fitted with a core device, a small implant that also serves as the player's health bar. Not long after his imprisonment, things start to unravel. The prison falls into chaos as inmates and guards alike begin mutating into horrific creatures known as biophage. Jacob allies himself with Elias, a long-term inmate who knows the prison's inner workings, and the two hatch an escape plan. Along the way, Jacob crosses paths again with Danny, who insists that the cargo he was carrying is directly connected to the catastrophic Europa outbreak, an event that cost thousands of lives, including her sister's. Their uneasy alliance carries them through the crumbling prison complex and into the mining colony buried beneath Callisto's surface. It's here that Jacob uncovers fragments of the truth. The UJC has been experimenting with alien parasites found below ground, and Warden Duncan Cole envisions this as the key to human evolution. What began as a simple cargo run steadily spirals into a struggle for survival amid corporate secrets and personal guilt. The game's big turning point comes when Jacob discovers that the crates he delivered— Jim, I hear you say? Didn't you say earlier that he was just setting out on his delivery? Yes, I did, my astute friend. This is one of many issues we're going to touch on shortly. Anyway, the crates he delivered were not what they seemed. Hidden beneath some medical supplies were biophage canisters, and the implication is that he unknowingly carried the cause of the Europa outbreak. This revelation reframes Jacob's journey. No longer just an innocent pilot caught in the wrong place, he is confronted with the possibility that his actions have helped unleash catastrophe on a planetary scale. The story builds towards its climax when Danny is infected. In order to save her, Jacob must face down Ferris, who by this point has mutated into the Warden's prized alpha. Their confrontation gives Jacob the blood sample needed to craft an antidote. Danny is cured, but Jacob remains behind, sacrificing himself as she escapes. In his final moments, Warden Cole appears to deliver a cryptic speech about humanity's evolution, hinting that Jacob's story may not be entirely over. I'd like to take a moment at this point to go off script a little bit and just to let everybody know that The purpose of this series is to get the best possible example of the game as it was released, to understand the initial issues, the initial reviews of the game. So while I understand that there was DLC, I never played it, because frankly, I'm of the opinion that if your story is not finished in the main game, then frankly, you've ripped off your customers. So the main story is all that we'll be touching on in this one. So let's go over controls. From the very start, the Callisto Protocol introduces you to its controls, and frankly, it's in the most straightforward way possible. The basics are very familiar. Left stick to move, right stick to control the camera. Interaction is tied almost entirely to one button, pressing it to open doors, vault obstacles, climb ledges, or rummage through containers. On paper, it's clean and consistent, but in practice, it can feel like everything in the game world is asking you to do the same thing, with slightly different contexts. Combat builds on this foundation with a focus on melee. The baton swings with weight, and the dodge mechanic is handled through the left stick rather than a dedicated button, simply tilting left or right to evade incoming blows. It's an elegant idea, don't get me wrong, no extra commands to remember, just movement doubled up as defense. Early on, this feels intuitive, almost refreshing compared to the traditional press a button to dodge that many game systems rely on today. But that simplification can also make the controls feel unresponsive. The dodge mechanic works on timing, not direction, so you can lean the stick either way and achieve the same result. It doesn't matter how you move, only when and that you do move, which means you never feel like you're making meaningful choices in combat, as if you are suggesting where Jacob should go, and the game decides whether or not it's going to allow it. At times, such as crawling through vents, this even results in Jacob continuing forward despite you trying to pull back, leaving you with certain deaths that feel a little unfair.
Stand down. Inmate, cease all hostile activity.
Ranged combat adds its own quirks. Weapons are powerful in theory, but aiming lacks precision, and swapping between guns mid-fight involves Jacob physically detaching an attachment and snapping on another. It's immersive in concept, but clunky in execution, especially when seconds matter. Healing items follow a similar logic. They require you to stand still, watch an animation, and commit to vulnerability in that moment. The intention is clear. Keep the player grounded, make every action deliberate, yet the inconsistency in how these mechanics are taught, with something as crucial as health injectors never actually receiving a proper tutorial, undercuts the design. Taken together, the control scheme is a microcosm of the game itself, bold ideas that sometimes shine, weighed down by execution that doesn't always live up to the ambition. So let's talk about its good points. Within the game, there are flashes of genuine quality. To give credit where credit's due, the game is visually striking. Character models are finely detailed, environments often breathtaking, and every so often, the lighting team delivers something truly remarkable. The sound design is also top tier. Seriously, if you play this game, make sure to wear headphones, and the atmosphere can become genuinely unsettling. The cast do their best with what they're given. Josh Duhamel, I actually don't know if that's how you pronounce his last name, and I apologize if I've gotten that wrong. He's serviceable. Karen Fukuhara clearly has the talent, but has little to work with when it comes to the script. And Sam Witwer, well, he devours every scene he's in, raising the bar literally every time he speaks. Gameplay as well shows early promise. The baton feels solid and weighty, the dodge mechanic is straightforward but functional, and the GRP or the grip glove, something that we'll touch on a little bit later, hints at creative potential. Also later on, we'll touch a little bit more on the stealth mechanics, but there is a section later in the game where there are some blind enemies, and this stands out as one of the few times the stealth mechanic feels consistent. There were moments in this part of the game specifically that really kept me on edge. And when it comes to the good points, yeah, that's it. Flashes, sparks of brilliance that never quite ignite into something greater. So, with the positives acknowledged, it's time to shift gears and dig into the areas where the game falls short. Don't get me wrong, there's going to be a few moments here where I'm going to go off script because when I was trying to write something coherent, I would just get mad. So there are going to be points where you have to bear with me, and I apologize for that. As mentioned earlier, from the moment you take control of Jacob, something feels off. Movement isn't direct or responsive. It's like you're nudging him with suggestions rather than giving commands. Every step feels floaty and imprecise, as if the game is constantly second-guessing your input. And this isn't just a mild irritation, it actively gets you killed. Which brings me to a certain gripe. Horror thrives on the player feeling vulnerable, but in control. If you make the wrong move, you pay the price. It's very similar to any of the Souls games. Yes, they're difficult, but you usually come out of it going, I'm the one that stuffed up here. I missed this dodge. I missed this parry. And then you go back in there with that knowledge. Unfortunately, Callisto tends to flip that on its head. You do the right thing and the game ignores you completely and you die anyway. And instead of being scared due to the atmosphere of the game, you're just left frustrated. Now let's talk about the lighting. I did mention before that this is one of the elements where the Callisto Protocol occasionally shines. Early in the game, there is this striking moment when you first see the shoe, the area of the prison that you're working towards. It's bathed in a faint glow and surrounded by drifting mist. The way the shadows fall, the fog rolls, and the light cuts through the environment creates a scene that feels genuinely atmospheric, a rare beacon of hope in a world built on despair. It's a glimpse of what the game could have achieved if this standard of visual telling had been maintained. Unfortunately, these moments are the exception rather than the rule, though. For every scene that looks good, there are several where the lighting actively undermines the atmosphere. One of the worst examples is in a room lit entirely with strobing effects. It's not a subtle flickering tension builder, but a harsh rapid-fire glare that overwhelms the senses and washes away all environmental detail. Rather than heightening the fear, it distracts to the point of breaking immersion. Even outside of these extremes, the lighting often feels inconsistent. Instead of natural shifts from one space to another, the game frequently simulates brightness simply by raising the gamma when you step into certain areas, as if someone behind the curtain is adjusting a dimmer switch on the fly. The result of this is that entire sections of scenery become overexposed, erasing the detail that the art team worked so hard to include. In many ways, the lighting serves as a metaphor for the Callisto Protocol itself. Occasional flashes of brilliance that are repeatedly drowned out by decisions that feel rushed, unrefined, or simply puzzling. Vents. If the Callisto Protocol had a subtitle, it would be Jacob Lee, Professional Vent Technician. This game is obsessed with vents, crawling through them, dropping out of them, watching enemies scuttle into them like it's an AliExpress remake of Alien. At first you think, okay, this is just a loading trick, a clever way to make transitions, but then you realize, no, this isn't clever design. This is an entire game loop in itself. There are so many vents that by the halfway point, you stop dreading what's inside them and start wondering if Jacob should switch careers. Forget being a cargo pilot. Clearly the man's true calling is HVAC repair. And going off script here, that's not an exaggerated number, by the way. I counted at least 40 vents that I went through in this game. You half expect him to whip out a wrench and start charging the monsters for routine maintenance. What's worse is that the vents aren't even consistent in how they're used. Sometimes enemies burst out of them. Sometimes they're just empty. Sometimes you see an enemy crawl into one only for the game to forget to actually put an exit hole in the next room. Seriously, have a look at this. This is immersion breaking, lazy, and after the 10th or 15th time, it's downright comical. There's literally no vent for him to come out of. No, seriously, there's nothing. The GRP glove or the grip glove. On paper, this thing should be the coolest toy in the box. The idea of grabbing enemies with telekinetic force and hurling them into environmental hazards is tailor-made for horror action fun. And right when you first get it, the game sets up the stage for it. There are spike walls conveniently placed in the same room as your first GRP encounter, which is a perfect setup for a brutal cinematic kill. Except, it doesn't work. No, seriously, the glove is so underpowered in its base form that you can't even throw the enemies into the obvious hazard that the level designers put right in front of you. Instead of introducing you to the mechanic and letting you experiment with environmental kills, the game reduces your new toy to little more than a weak push. It's not until you've sunk most of your upgrade points into the glove itself that you finally realize, oh, I could have been doing that the whole time. One of the game's few genuinely creative mechanics is buried so deep you might never uncover it unless you're stubborn enough to grind out the upgrades. But the biggest sin with the grip batteries. The item that recharges your glove. Get a full-blown tutorial. First of all, I would like to point out, the grip recharges its power on its own. You do not need batteries for it. However, they're in the game anyway, and they get a full-blown tutorial pop-up explaining exactly what they are and how to use them, which is great. And as I mentioned before, health injectors, the single most important item in the game, do not get an explanation. And I'm not even exaggerating. When I got these batteries, that's when I thought, hang on a second. I've never been shown how to use the injectors. I must have missed it. I combed through my footage. I recorded every second of the game that I played to try and find it, as I was so sure that I must have missed it, and there was nothing. Stealth in the Callisto Protocol is the definition of wasted potential. Early on, the game teaches you a neat little takedown. You creep up behind an enemy, press a button, and Jacob stabs them in the side, then stabs them in the head. Job well done. It sets the expectation that stealth will be a viable alternative to combat, and you think, great, I can save ammo, avoid detection, and actually feel clever for once. But the game doesn't actually follow through on this. For hours after the tutorial, you almost never get a chance to use it. The level design forces combat encounters, and enemies spot you instantly, and the mechanics just sit there, forgotten, like a party trick the devs were proud of for 5 minutes before losing interest. The only time stealth actually works is with the blind enemies introduced later, and even then, it's just holding still until they wander past. They're the one group that consistently follows the rules set up for them. But by the time they show up, you've gone so long without stealth being relevant that you've probably forgotten the system exists at all. And then there's the insult of the head explosion problem. Earlier in the game teaches you that a stealth kill equals stab to the head equals instant death. Logical enough. But later on in combat, you can literally blow an enemy's head clean off, and they'll keep fighting like nothing happened. So what is it, game? Does head damage matter, or doesn't it? Horror relies on rules that you can trust. Break those rules, and all you've got left is frustration. In the end, stealth in Callisto Protocol feels like it was added so that they could put stealth mechanics on the marketing sheet, and not because they had any actual intention of building the game around it. Now, if you are hoping for tense and memorable showdowns in Callisto Protocol, I'm really sorry. The boss fights here are some of the most uninspired, spongy encounters I've seen in years. Take the first big mutant, for example. He shows up with this dramatic build-up, roaring like a proper threat, and you think, oh, here we go. Mechanics, strategy, maybe even an environmental kill. There's even a giant fan in the background, practically screaming to be a part of the fight. But nope, the fan is just decoration. The fight boils down to circling around, pumping bullets into a giant health bar, and dodging the same lumbering swings over and over and over until he eventually ragdolls like a sack of meat. It's not tense, it's just tedious, and it does not get any better. Later on, you face Ferris, played brilliantly by Sam Witwer, by the way, and yet the game somehow manages to make him boring too. His boss fight feels less like duels with a menacing villain, and more like a test of how many shotgun shells you've hoarded. The first time you fight him in his kind of alpha form, he blocks every melee strike and counters like an MMA fighter hopped up on steroids, which forces you into repetitive range combat that highlights just how floaty and unreliable the shooting actually is. Then when he transforms into generic mutant number 12 with fingers growing out of his fingers, and then you've just got to blast the glowing weak spot on his head like it's 2008. The worst part is that the game introduces new mechanics right at the end of these fights, as if that somehow counts as death. Ferris's second form forces you to break a regenerating shield before targeting his head, a completely new idea that's never taught or hinted at before. Horror thrives on clarity. You set the rules, you make the player master them, and then you test their mastery. Callisto just throws things in last minute, hoping that the sheer spectacle distracts you from how shallow it really is.
Confusion is an important part of horror, and providing information, maybe misinformation, or taking away information, or making information abstract. Making information abstract.
At their best, these fights are spongy. At their worst, they're lazy. None of them feel like earned climaxes. They're roadblocks, artificially lengthening a campaign that already drags its feet. Now, every game has its fair share of inconsistencies. Small oversights in quality control are usually inevitable, and when the overall experience is strong, they're easy to forgive. But the Callisto Protocol isn't just guilty of the occasional slip. Some of its flaws are so glaringly obvious that they can't be ignored. These are some of the moments that completely pull you out of the experience, and I cannot move on without drawing your attention to them. Think of these as honorable mentions, as you will. Immediately as you start to traverse the burning prison at the start of the game, you meet Elias, and we'll talk more about him later as a character, but he is immediately helpful and offers you his shiv. This is his shiv in question. No, seriously, this man somehow has a metal spanner or wrench, depending on where you are in the world, and it's shaped into a shiv. I have a number of questions for this. How did he hide this? This had to have been machined down. Where the hell in the prison are they allowing this to happen? He mentions that he has been in the prison half his life. He looks about 40. That means about 20 years. 20 years is usually a murder charge. How the hell are they allowing machines that would enable this thing to be machined down into a shiv? I'd also like to point out that they specify that it is a shiv. You use the shiv for two things. One is opening these frickin' power boxes. Have a look at this. Look at where he actually puts the shiv, but then when the cable falls, look at where it's actually cut. I know that this is minute, and I know that if I wasn't actively looking for things, I probably wouldn't have noticed this nor cared, but quality control is so important. Speaking of quality control, let's go to graphics on this prisoner. First of all, look at the back of Jacob's head. It is really, really well animated. It is brilliantly modeled. You can see each individual hair follicle, every little indentation in his skin. It is brilliant. Now, I mean no offense to any of my viewers that are balded in this moment, but that is the definition of a fucking chrome dome. And I don't even mean that just because he's bald. There is no texture on that head. It is completely smooth. It either has not rendered or it has not been rendered by the actual team itself. In order to make sure that it wasn't my issue, that it wasn't a specific issue on my game, I asked a friend of mine to download the game and play up to this point just to see if it was the same. And yeah, it absolutely was the same. The friend of mine immediately turned the game off, deleted it, and never saw it again. So this wasn't just an isolated issue. Now, keeping in mind, though, we both did play this on the Xbox Game Pass, on the PC version of the Game Pass, rather. So I don't know if there was an issue specifically there or not, or what the go was, but this was stupid. But then looking at my own footage here, I'm looking at the head, and then have a look at the hand. The hand is really well textured. But not just that. It's a different color to the head. How can you expect to be giving out a good game with just quality control issues like this? This is insane. Now, before we get into characters or anything like that, there's a whole section in this video dedicated to characters. This particular moment is something that annoys me.
sure know a lot about this place.
Yeah, I've had nothing but time.
Okay, so what's next? The shoe? Can we just waltz our way in there?
I wish we could. It's not gonna be that easy, bruv. Look, I've been here a long time. I've got privileges that you don't. So I'm gonna have to take you a different way. But I'll be your eyes and ears and I'll guide you along.
All right, don't you leave me hanging.
So, I'm going to go back over that. Elias says to Jacob, I've been here a while and I have permissions. And to give some context, he's specifically talking about using the control room to open up doors in the prison. He has mentioned that he has been here for half of his life, and as I explained before, it's probably around 20 years, which means he's probably in here for a murder charge. Motherfucker, no prison is going to give you permissions to open the doors. The fact that the writers put this in and just said, yeah, that's fine, is so fucking annoying. Fuck off, game. This next one is a little bit of a nitpick, don't get me wrong, but the game really couldn't decide how it wanted to do tutorials. For instance, when you get your hands on your first gun, down in the bottom right corner is a very small, unobtrusive tutorial that shows you exactly what you need to do on the fly. And I'm not gonna lie, I quite liked this. It felt as though the game wanted the momentum to keep going. And then you have items like the grip battery, that I have mentioned a couple of times now, where it brings up just a wall of text. It genuinely felt like the developers had this nice idea for the gun, but really had no idea how to implement that when it came to the grip batteries, so they just didn't. Now this one is also a small gripe, but I have mentioned, and I will die on this hill, that the sound design in this game is truly spectacular. For some reason, I don't know if this was unique to my experience or not, the volume of Jacob versus the volume of whoever is speaking to you on comms in the game, oh, just listen to this.
The lockup had already been raided. All that's left is this baton.
Stun baton, yeah. But those things do pack a punch, though. And we are gonna need it.
Alright. Later on in the game, probably around the 2/3 mark of the game, you meet up with Danny again, and she is in this room upstairs fighting off a bunch of the biophages, and you've got to clear out the room below. Once you clear out that room, you get the prompt to shiv the door open. Now, through this entire scene, have a listen to the sound of the gun that Danny is using. Now, this was an interesting point of call to me, because I assumed that she was using some form of automatic shotgun, or with the rate of fire, hell, she could have even have been using an assault rifle. In fact, I put the question to my friends, I sent them that tiny little bit of footage, and asked them, hey, based upon the sound design, what gun do you think she's using? And it was a mixed bag. Now, granted, we are Australian and we don't really handle guns, but the general consensus was either an automatic shotgun or some form of AR. So when we do finally open the door, Danny gives us the gun, and it turns out to be a shotgun that you cannot fire anywhere near as fast as Danny was. And people can't even use the argument of, oh, maybe she was using a different weapon. She didn't have another weapon on her, as far as you could see, so you can't even use that as an excuse. But truly, moving on to the last 2 points that are back-to-back issues that I have with this game. In fact, these probably shouldn't be in honorable mentions. They probably should have their own dedicated section in the video. I want you to watch this scene. I'm going to play this scene completely unimpeded. I'm not even going to talk over it, and then we're going to watch it again together, and I'm going to go over why it's bullshit.
There it is.
2 minutes out.
It's right on time. It's a hell of a lot bigger than my old ship.
Think you could fly it?
Yeah, I'll fly anything that gets us off this rock. But what are you doing?
It's not me.
No. One must learn to accept what they cannot control. Still, I'm impressed that you made it this far. Perhaps you both have potential after all. Mr. Lee, Miss Nakamura, your journey was especially long. All the way from
say?
But I'm afraid there's just too much at stake here. And the protocol cannot be broken. So, though your story ends here, please know that you have my respect.
Never! Go! 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 Go!
Jacob! Take my hand! Jacob!
Alright, I think that might be enough. Let's rewind it back to that initial spot, right? So, I have a couple of issues with this. A large part of the reason that Jacob has survived up to this point at all is the fact that he is a pilot. He is needed to pilot a ship off the prison. Danny has called that ship down, and it is autopiloting down. So what you're saying to me is, wherever that ship was, it can autopilot itself down to the prison, but it can't autopilot itself away from the prison. What kind of system is that? I do not and cannot understand the logic in that. Why would a system be able to autopilot it here, but not anywhere else? Anyway, moving on. As you can see, the ship gets blown up. Great, fantastic, that means more shitty game to play. But watch this explosion. You see this giant hole in the floor here? This wasn't there a second ago, and the explosion just happened. If that explosion caused that, first of all, there's no physical way it could have. All of a sudden, there's just a hole. And the only argument could be is, you see this part of the ship? This could have been what hit the ground and created that hole. But no, its trajectory is too far. And yet the hole is already there. What the fuck, game? So anyway, these two idiots start running, and they decide to jump. But let's time this jump, shall we? Right. That is an absurdly long amount of time to jump. And what does Jacob land in? He lands in a fucking vent! This game couldn't give you 1 second away from a vent. And I will not understand this, ever. But also, when Jacob wakes up, Danny pulls him into the next room, and you see the mining colony that is below. Now, I have issues with this as well. Fact of the matter is, this is clearly subterranean. This is clearly underground. You can see the ground roof. That's a sentence I never thought I would ever say in my life. But you can see the stone roof above you. And yet, when Jacob fell, at no point did he go underground. He went into a horizontal vent. This makes no sense. I do not understand how we got here. But it seems to me the same people working on the logic of this part of the game worked on another part as well. This time jumping right to the very start of the game. when Jacob is about to start his Amazon delivery trip, his co-pilot says, hey, look, there's a little warning button that's flashing. Do you want to go and check that out? And he goes, yeah, mate, I'll go and check that out. Sorry, this makes me really mad. My full-blown Australian has absolutely come out in this moment. So he goes and checks it. And what does he find? This.
What's up?
We've been boarded.
Oh, shit.
This isn't just a small issue. This is a full-on breach in what is meant to be an air-locked, compressed vehicle. And there is a fire inside. It is on fire. There is no warning for that. There's no automated Siri device to say, hey, shit's on fire, yo. You might want to go check it. And then you play through the entire tutorial trying to avoid these people, just for Jacob to start sprinting up the stairs and give away his position at the end of this. And then you've got Danny looking at him through the window. She shoots the window out as Jacob is pulling the airlock. And I'm sorry, this door is all that is saving you from depressurization? You wouldn't think there would be some form of fail-safe? There was one bullet that took out that pane of glass. One singular bullet between you and a depressurized ship that will kill you if you fuck up. This is a sin of logic, and it drives me insane. So, if survival horror lives or dies on atmosphere, it thrives on characters, people you care about, or at least enjoy hating. Callisto Protocol manages neither. Every horror story needs an anchor, a protagonist that we can either root for, empathize with, or at least understand. Dead Space had Isaac Clarke, the working-class engineer whose desperation and trauma made him compelling. The Callisto Protocol gives us Jacob Lee, a man so bland you could spread him on toast and call it plain butter. From the start, Jacob is defined by his lack of reaction. His ship crashes, his co-pilot dies, and he barely bats an eyelid. Monsters start bursting out of nearby vents, and Jacob reacts with all the urgency of someone being told they left the oven on. Where's the fear? Where's the horror? Even a shred of gallows humor would have worked. Instead, he's just flat. The game tries to deepen his character with what it calls the Europa twist, the big reveal that Jacob may have played a part in the wider outbreak. But rather than adding complexity, it just raises more questions than answers. We'll get into that properly in the next section, but suffice it to say here, Jacob doesn't come out looking like a tragic hero, he comes out looking like a moron. And the worst part? He never really changes. Jacob starts confused, stumbles through 8 hours of nonsense, and ends still confused, just with a few more scars. In a genre built on psychological torment and transformation, Jacob is a protagonist who simply exists to push buttons and trigger cutscenes. When your main character is less interesting than the prison walls around him, you've failed at storytelling. Elias is supposed to be Jacob's anchor inside the prison, the grizzled inmate who's been here half his life, knows the layout, and becomes the de facto guide through Black Iron Prison. On paper, that's fine. Every horror game benefits from a side character who grounds the story and provides direction. The problem? Elias is completely wasted. He's introduced with just enough backstory to make you think he'll be important, but the game never gives him the time or depth to earn your investment. He's basically a glorified quest marker. Go here, push that button, meet me at this tower. You don't learn much about his past, and you don't see him grow, and his personality amounts to generic inmate who's conveniently helpful. And then there's this big emotional death scene, which I knew was going to happen immediately, because in the scene before, he gets really sappy. Like, overly sappy. But anyway, the music swells, Jacob looks devastated, and the game practically begs you to feel something. But why would you? You've known Elias for about 2 hours. His dialogue has been nothing but exposition dumps, and his relationship with Jacob hasn't progressed beyond we're stuck in this hellhole together. I mean, compare that to Dead Space, where secondary characters either had rich backstories or shocking betrayals. Elias, he's a speed bump, a narrative prop. The worst part is how avoidable it was. If Elias had been up front from the start, if he'd just given Jacob real information instead of dribs and drabs, if their partnership had been fleshed out through actual trust building, his death might have carried some weight. Instead, it lands with the emotional impact of dropping your toast butter side down. In short, Elias isn't a character. He's a plot device with a pulse. And when he dies, you don't grieve him. You just sigh and wonder how many more hours you're going to be playing this game for. Danny Nakamura is introduced as the fiery leader of the Outer Way, a supposed terrorist group, and one of the few people in the story with clear motive. Sounds promising, right? A strong foil to Jacob, ideological clashes, maybe even a moral grey area where you're not sure if she's the enemy or the reluctant ally. But instead of building on that setup, the game ties her character into a knot of contradictions. One moment she's trying to kill Jacob, the next she's reluctantly teaming up with him, and within a few hours she's flipping back again. Her trust issues aren't portrayed as understandable suspicion. They're written like someone slamming a light switch on and off. I don't trust you. I trust you. No, I don't trust you. Wait, now I do. It's exhausting. It's not intriguing. Her logic is even worse, but it's just silly. Later still, after you guys have made your way out of the prison and into the underground mining area, she insists that she wants answers, meaning she wants to go back to the very prison that became a nightmare factory. Why? What's her plan? The game never tells you because the writers clearly didn't know either.
Because we told the story in such, it was so disjointed. You know, we'd shoot like the end of the game first, and then they were sort of writing it as they went. They'd realize, okay, this works. We need to fix this. Or we need to, amp this part of it up more. So you're constantly sort of, okay, what happened before this? What happened before this?
And then there's her big bonding moment with Jacob. She sees what's inside the crate. Medical supplies instead of weapons, and immediately flips from total distrust to, okay, now we're best mates. That's not character development, that's narrative whiplash. Realistically, she should still hate Jacob's guts. He's tied to the Europa incident after all, at least according to you, but instead, the script decides it's time for the reluctant allies to become real partners. And don't get me wrong, there are times where that works, but only when that trust is gained over time. This is so flippant and far too jarring. Danny had the potential as a hardened revolutionary, with secrets worth uncovering. Instead, she's reduced to a cardboard cutout with a broken switch labelled Trust. The only consistency is that she's inconsistent. Ferris, played by the ever-reliable Sam Witwer, is the closest thing the Callisto Protocol has to a memorable character. Witwer has the presence, the menace, and the delivery to make even the cheesiest lines land with real weight. His early scenes, particularly when he tells Jacob,
You know, they call Callisto the dead moon. Dead. Just like you would have been if I hadn't fished you out of that wreck. I mean, shit. As far as anyone else is concerned, you are dead. It's time you moved on.
actually feel chilling. For a moment you think, oh, here we go, a proper villain. And then the game promptly wastes him. Ferris is saddled with a cartoonishly vague motivation. Loyal to the Warden, devoted to the big human evolution plan, and spends most of his screen time as a glorified henchman. Worse, the game teases his mechanical gauntlet early on, making you think it's a strength enhancer. Like, actually look at this. This is the grip glove. And he pulls you up like you're nothing. But then it flips the script into surprise, it's actually a Jedi Force power glove now. Instead of a consistent, intimidating piece of tech, it becomes a narrative crutch, used whenever the writers need Jacob to get ragdolled across the room. His eventual transformation into a generic mutant boss is the final insult. Sam Witwer is a man capable of carrying entire franchises with his voice and physicality. He gets reduced to grunts, roars, and a bullet sponge fight that could have been any faceless monster. The nuance, the menace, the character is stripped away in favor of another glowing weak spot to shoot. Ferris could have been Callisto's saving grace, a complex antagonist with charisma, a human face to contrast the biophage horror. Instead, he's wasted an opportunity. The one actor giving a performance worth remembering, buried under the same lazy writing that drags everything else down. And the rest of the characters? They exist to die quickly, because apparently a high body count equals high drama. Except it doesn't. It just reminds you how little you care. I've realized after reading this line in the script that there is actually one other character, and she is literally the doctor that puts the core device in your neck, and then she talks to you later to tell you how to get the antidote to save Danny. That's literally her purpose. She has no other involvement with the story except for those 2 moments. Now, if Callisto Protocol were a movie, it would be the kind where every scene stops dead so someone can slowly walk down a corridor, open a door, and then discover another locked corridor behind it. For a game that's barely 8 hours long, it somehow manages to feel like it lasts forever. Not because the story is deep, but because it's padded to hell. Progress is consistently interrupted by the same cheap tricks. A door breaks, a catwalk collapses, a character says, "Meet me at the tower," only for the tower to be blocked off by rubble. Every time you think you're moving forward, the game yanks you sideways into another pointless detour. It's not tension, it's tedium. And when half of those detours end with yet another vent crawl, the frustration just multiplies. Even the few story beats that might have landed are buried under this stop-start design. Allies get separated so often that it becomes a running joke. Environments repeat themselves with barely any changes, and entire sections drag on with wave-based combat encounters that add nothing except another excuse to waste your dwindling ammo supply. Horror works when pacing is tight, when every encounter, every corridor, every pause is deliberate. Callisto Protocol just throws roadblocks in your way, stretching what should have been a sharp, atmospheric 4-hour experience into a bloated slog that makes you want to put the controller down. If there is a single moment where the Callisto Protocol completely unravels, it's the so-called Europa twist. The game wants you to believe that Jacob is the tragic fool responsible for the catastrophe on Europa, but the timeline is such a mess, it collapses the second you actually look at it. Jacob sets off from Black Iron Prison, heading to Europa with a ship full of mysterious crates. Mid-flight, a breaking news broadcast lights up the cabin. Europa is already burning. People are dying on the streets, and Danny Nakamura is plastered all over the screen as the terrorist leader supposedly behind it. The implication is obvious. The disaster has already begun. Now I need to take a moment here to explain exactly what breaking news is. According to the internet, and I'm quoting Wikipedia, which I understand Wikipedia is not always the best article to take your information from, but it words it the best, and the other definitions that I've read all aim for the same point. This is just easier to digest. Breaking news, also called late breaking news, a special report, special coverage, or a news flash, is a current issue that warrants the interruption of a scheduled broadcast in order to report its details. News broadcasters also use the term for continuing coverage of events of broad interest to viewers, attracting accusations of sensationalism. So I could be wrong in saying this, but seeing as this particular moment is breaking news, this should be the first chance that they have had to actually report on it. And given that the Callisto Protocol is set in the year 2320, I can imagine in that time, the transmission of news, information, and that sort of thing has only gotten quicker. And I understand that the second half of that definition is stating that news broadcasters also use it for continuing coverage of events, but there is no evidence to say that this is a continuation of coverage. This is the first information that they are giving. This is them telling a brand new story. And then, within minutes of this being shown on TV, Danny somehow infiltrates Jacob's ship. Now think about that for a moment. She's leading the charge on Europa 1 second, then she's hiding in his cargo hold the next. Unless she teleported across the system, this is an impossible contradiction that the game never bothers to explain. And it gets worse. In the later part of the game, Jacob finally opens one of the crates in front of Danny. By the way, with a gloved hand using a fingerprint scanner, which is comedy gold in itself, and finds nothing but medical supplies. No horror, no reveal, just bog standard cargo. It's only later, in a dreamlike flashback, that he realizes, and I hope you heard the quotation marks in my voice when I said realizes, the crates had a false bottom all along, hiding the biophage canisters underneath, with one canister missing. And Jacob suddenly blames himself for causing the Europa outbreak. But here's the problem. The outbreak was already plastered across the news before he had even left port. If one canister was missing, then he must have delivered it on an earlier run. Which means what? He made a delivery to Europa, watched an entire colony collapse, flew all the way back to Black Iron, reloaded the same ship with the same crates, just to have one canister missing, and then set off to Europa again? Why deliver just one, just to return and try again? Why would Danny wait until the second trip to board him? Why does none of this match what the player is shown? The only conclusion you can draw is that the writers didn't care. They wanted their big emotional twist, Jacob burdened with guilt, realizing he was the cause of it all. But they couldn't even line up the basic timeline of their own story to make it work. Instead of tragedy, you get farce. Instead of a gut punch reveal, you get a protagonist blaming himself for something that had already happened before he had even left the hangar. The Europa twist doesn't just fail, it annihilates the story's entire credibility. The very moment that should have defined Jacob as a character instead proves that the writers couldn't even keep their own plot straight. Now, every good horror game needs a central protagonist. The brain behind the madness, the hand pulling the strings. The Callisto Protocol gives us Warden Cole. It never occurred to me that Protocol and Cole were so close. And I hope that the writers didn't do that on purpose. Anyway, he's a man who wanders in and out of holograms to deliver the most generic, reheated villain speeches you've ever heard. And his grand plan? Humanity must evolve. That's it. That's the depth. No nuance, no compelling logic, not even a half-decent pseudoscience justification. Just, we need to evolve. Like it's a motivational poster at a gym. It's one of the most overused tropes in sci-fi, and here it lands with all the impact of a wet fart in the elevator. The problem isn't just the cliche, though. It's that the game spends hours teasing some big conspiracy, some deeper purpose behind the biophage outbreak, only to boil it all down to, we did it for progress? The game even undercuts its own villain by making him feel detached from the chaos. Literally every time you see him in the game, he's just a floating hologram rambling about destiny while everyone else does the heavy lifting. He's less malevolent mastermind and more annoying pop-up ad. And when the final confrontation comes, what are we left with? No grand reveal, no complex ideology, just that there are a few more people in some board of directors that are part of the conspiracy. There's not even a satisfying monologue, just more vague babble about evolution before handing the stage back to Ferris, who at least looks intimidating. Warden Cole isn't a villain. He's a narrative afterthought, shoved in because the game felt like it needed somebody at the top of the food chain. And then by adding these other members, they prove that he's not the top of the food chain. In a story already crippled by the Europa twist, this was the chance to pull things together, to give the chaos a purpose, to give an explanation. Instead, the Warden's master plan feels like it was scribbled on a napkin 5 minutes before the writers decided to call it a day. Here's another honorable mentions when it comes to the game, little things that got added in the late game that just didn't make sense. So a little bit more about the core devices that are implanted in your neck that work as your health bar. Not only do they do that, they work as a comm device that apparently anybody can just hack into, and you do need to splice out a couple of them out of the necks of certain guards in order to gain access to certain doors throughout the game. And apparently, somewhere around the 6-hour mark of the game, they decide that the core devices don't just record data. Apparently, you can now jack into a corpse's memories. Danny literally plugs herself into a dead man's brain and relives his last moments like she's watching a highlight reel. This mechanic appears out of nowhere and is just used to keep Danny quiet whilst Jacob is looking for her. And as quickly as this mechanic appears, it disappears just as quickly. And nothing gets explained. It never gets explained as to how this is a possibility now. Why did we spend half the game ripping out cores to listen to static-filled audio logs to get the information we needed? Why not always use the memory dive trick? The answer? Because the writers needed Danny to do something dramatic in that scene. Logic be damned. Seriously, have a look at this. This is what you're faced with.
You didn't deserve this.
Danny. Hey, Danny.
Get away from me!
And as you can see, it's just another inconsistent Danny moment. So, was the Callisto Protocol really that bad? Yes. Without hesitation, yes. It's one of the clearest examples of a game that had every advantage on its side. Experienced devs, Hollywood actors, a sky-high budget, a marketing push with its own mini docuseries, and still managed to trip over its own shoelaces and faceplant into the pavement. On the surface, this game looks incredible. The sound design is great. The performances from actors like Sam Witwer are genuinely strong. There are fleeting moments. A perfectly lit corridor, a single tense encounter, where you can almost see the great game it wanted to be. But all of that is drowned in a sea of boneheaded design decisions, broken mechanics, and a narrative so contradictory it feels like 3 different scripts got stapled together. The combat, clunky, repetitive, and heavily reliant on melee when the game pretends to be a shooter. The stealth, introduced, abandoned, then reintroduced 6 hours later as if the game forgot it existed. The story anchored around the Europa twist, which makes so little sense it actively undermines the entire premise. And the pacing? Constant detours, endless event crawls, separation counters that become a running gag. All padding, no payoff. But you want to know the real kicker? The Callisto Protocol launched in December of 2022. As I mentioned at the start of this video, it released Among Titans. Do you want to know what released 1 month later in January of 2023? Dead Space. Not a new sequel, but a remake of the original. And it was everything Callisto wasn't. Tight, atmospheric, mechanically refined, and narratively consistent. The so-called spiritual successor got obliterated by the very game it was meant to replace. Any momentum that Callisto could have had died instantly, buried under Isaac Clarke's heavy boots. In the end, the Callisto Protocol isn't just bad, it's a cautionary tale. A lesson in what happens when style takes priority over substance, when hubris overrides planning, and when you try to manufacture the next Dead Space instead of actually understanding what made that series work in the first place. If I had to give it a score, generous as I am, it's a 3 out of 10. A few flashes of brilliance buried under a mountain of mediocrity, and the only real horror here is realizing just how much talent and money got wasted on something so fundamentally broken. Anyway, that's it for me for today. Let me know what you guys thought in the comments below. If you're into music, I also have the channel Griever Productions, in which I react to vocalists from the opinion of a vocal coach, but let me know what you want to see next. Tell me in the comments below, what is a game that came out and everyone hated it? And maybe, just maybe, you'll see one of those videos done on that game. Anyway, bye for now.